very welcome to the lecture by Dr. George Michell on the Islamic architecture of Deccan, India, Maja and Golconda. We are extremely lucky to have Dr. Michell here once again. He's been a frequent visitor to Ahmedabad and made his first visit to the campus in 1979. So this year, later on, it'll be 40 years with his association on this campus. It was because of meeting Abdullah Shah that then he has been able to develop a relationship that has enabled him to come back again and again, for which we are most grateful. Dr. Michell will perhaps need no introduction to most of you, but for those of you who don't know, he's an architect and architectural historian hailing from Australia originally and presenting his master's in London at the School of African and Oriental Studies. He's had a lifetime involvement with India and the various diverse architectural traditions of India, and has been a pioneer in documenting huge areas of great interest that have been otherwise undocumented or unrepresented. He distinguishes himself in his passionate engagement with fact and information. His interest is in establishing order in terms of sites and in terms of the nature of architecture on the sites, and using particularly drawings as a tool and photography develops hugely important resources across various sites in India. He's in the midst of a very busy work schedule and is presenting this now. There are other volumes coming out on the Deccan. He's got a particular attachment to the Deccan, and there are other projects in the pipeline as well. So we're lucky to catch him. We're most grateful that he's here, and we look forward to hearing his lecture today. Thank you, Doctor.
Arthur's so tall, I have to be careful with this. Arthur, thank you for that introduction. We are very old workmates from early 1980. We met in Hampi, Vijayanagara, which is in Karnataka, which is in the Deccan. And let me just say a few words about an area of India that has not my exclusive interest, but has become something of a passion. Now, for those of you who are not very good on geography, this is the Deccan, this plateau. And it roughly encompasses the states of Maharashtra, Telangana, Andhra, and Karnataka. And it's a region of India that has a particularly diverse architectural tradition. Many different types of architectures are found there. And some of us who have done research in this area feel that perhaps these traditions are not sufficiently well appreciated or understood, and so we created something called the Deccan Heritage Foundation, DHF, and we publish guidebooks quite inexpensively, including on Hampi and Badami, Aurangabad, recently on the Kakatiyas of Warangal, and are now co-authoring one on the Hoysalers of Karnataka. And there's been Jewish heritage of Bombay and Pune, there have been seaports of Goa, etc., etc. So we have about 12 titles. And 2 or 3 years back we decided we should do a big, wonderful book on Islamic architecture of the Deccan, because such a book hadn't really been done. And this idea came out of an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York on Deccan arts, in which Antonio Martinelli, one of the great photographers of Indian architecture, had submitted pictures. So I said to Antonio, would you be prepared to go back to the Deccan and take more pictures so we could do a huge book on the subject, which he did. And with the help of 3 students from CEPT, including Claire, who was here, who made drawings and was sent out and drew extra measured plans, we produced a book that is now in the library. So now I'm interested in doing a book on temples of Deccan, that is, what was the architecture before Muslim traditions established themselves 7th to 13th centuries. That's my current project. But anyhow, tonight I'm going to talk about the 16th and 17th centuries in the Deccan, which is a very complicated story. So I'm not going to bore you with too much history, but I thought let's look at a few maps and get a handle on what was going on in this part of India. Now, if you would have come to India and travelled in the Deccan in the year 1500, let's say, you would find there was a big Hindu kingdom, the so-called Vijayanagara kingdom, and there were these different kingdoms, these smaller Muslim kingdoms, the Qutb Shahis of Golconda, the Adil Shahis of Bijapur, and then these other kingdoms. And what is so interesting about these dynasties, they each developed a distinctive style of architecture. So even though they built mosques and tombs and palaces and forts, and they used arches and vaults and squinches and pendentives, the style of each of these dynasties is something you can recognize. So evidently architecture was part of the personality and, how should I say, the visual culture of each of these kingdoms. So this is what was going on in about 1500. And there was a lot of antagonism over resources in the Deccan between all of these different dynasties. They all fought with each other. But one of these kings, this is Ali I of Bijapur, he was instrumental in getting all of the Muslim, I would say Deccan sultans together to fight against Vijayanagara. And in 1565, they won a great battle, which some of you may have read about, and they were able to establish themselves as the supreme rulers of the Deccan. With the result that, you'll see the minute when the map comes out, they were able to eradicate the threat of Vijayanagara. So by 1600, there's no more Vijayanagara, and you can see these two dynasties now have extended their sway. And with the treasure that they stole from Vijayanagara in 1565, they began to build on an extremely ambitious scale. And this situation continued for a good 100 years, but you can notice up here the Mughals from the north are already coming down into the Deccan, because they know the Deccan is wealthy, there are lots of resources that they want, and by the year 1700, they've gone. Bijapur is extinguished, the Adil Shahis are gone, Golconda, Hyderabad is gone, no more Qutb Shahis, and the Deccan becomes a province of the Mughal Empire, and that is the end of Sultanate architecture in the Deccan. Then we have provincial Mughal architecture in the Deccan. All this I know is extremely complicated, so don't worry about it. It's just we're going to look now at Bijapur. Now this is a plan of Bijapur, an old 19th century map. You can see it's a very approximate circular configuration, about 1.5 kilometers across, and with the major monuments mentioned here in black. And in the middle is a citadel, which is where the sultans of Bijapur had their residences, their audience halls, their pleasure pavilions. And their tombs, one of them was out here, others were out here, outside the city, the tombs of the sultans. Now this is one of the gateways leading into the citadel of Bijapur. It's not very remarkable architecturally, but it shows you the type of way in which they built, with arched recesses like this. Look at the voussoirs. You can see how they learned how to do this, all in a sort of local basalt. And then they used a very fine stone, it's a type of limestone I think, for an inscribed lintel, which gives the date, which I will now tell you. I'll just consult my notes first. 1539, so it's quite early on in the history of Bijapur. And once they had conquered Vijayanagara, there was money to build on this sort of scale. Now this is the Gagan Mahal, which is an extraordinarily impressive audience hall. Several things to be noted. It faces north. All the audience halls of the Deccan Sultans face north for reasons we don't know quite why this should be, but it was a tradition, perhaps imported from Central Asia or the Persian-speaking lands of the Middle East. Anyhow, look, here's a human being here, so it gives you some idea of the scale of this enormous arch. And here there would have been a throne with the sultan seated. There was no dome. It would be a flat roof structure with timber roof and intermediate timber stories, and you can just see the impressions of the timber columns embedded in the walls. So what you're looking at is a sort of carcass of a building with all the timbers removed. Because when the Mughals came, they destroyed all these ceremonial buildings so that the Adil Shahis could never again claim authority. So this is the Deccan Mahal at Bijapur. And this is the Chini Mahal, so called because ceramics were found here. This is a sort of, an administrative building inside the palace area. And what's so fascinating is that today, it's still an administrative building. So you can see they've got their laptops and computers, and they're doing various things, running the Bijapur City Council inside a late 16th century building, which is rather fascinating. So here you can see the arches dividing the hall into bays, and the types of vaults and domes here. And on this side, which is not clear, there is an arched opening where the Sultan could present himself and look down on the hall where learned discussions or visitors would have assembled. So it's a rare example of a late 16th century civic building in the Deccan still being used. And coming from this building is this screen. This is made of iron. It's about this big. It's beautifully cut. And obviously there were windows set into this building of iron jalis, which is very unusual. And for under circumstances which we don't know, this was removed from the Chini Mahal, and now it's installed in a church, which has been built inside a Bijapur gateway, which is always locked. So I have never seen it, but I know it exists there. So this is one of the palaces overlooking the outer walls of the Bijapur citadel. This is called the Sat Manzil Palace, probably late 16th century, and it was supposed to have had 6 or 7 stories, but this no longer exists. It does have 1, 2, 3, 4 levels. It's a vertical building with narrow staircases ascending from one level to the other. And the rooms may have been residential, they've been pleasurable, we don't know precisely what functions they had, and perhaps they never had precise functions, because buildings in medieval India, as in medieval Europe, were not designated by their functions. People may have slept in them by night, may have eaten in them during the evening, they may have entertained and seen people during the day. They had different functions depending on the time and the season. So this is one of the upper chambers of the Sat Manzil. You can see there is there's a little pond. There was water pipes. There was a way of siphoning water up, so there could be water bodies, and these wonderful decorative lobed arches set into pointed arches, and you can see all these complicated, imaginative vaulting systems that were used in this pleasure palace. And from here you could look out over the walls of the citadel into the city itself. And one of the things that you could see from the Sat Manzil was this pavilion. This is called the Jal Mandir, the water pavilion. It's very mysterious. It sits in a trench, you can see here, which was filled with water. There's no bridge. You can't actually get across to it. Even if you could get across to it, you can't get in it, because it's so small, there's no entry, there are these little windows. So we don't know what it could have been used for. There are various theories. Maybe it was a reliquary for something sacred and precious, but this is just an idea that some of us have had. What is interesting architecturally is the dependence on wooden architecture. You can see all these brackets. They're all cut out from basalt. Look here. This must imitate a timber type of architecture that was current in Bijapur during these centuries, for which we have no evidence anymore. We have no wooden architecture in Bijapur to speak of. But it's an exquisitely finished building, and it's topped by this sort of dome on petals. This is a palace which was built just outside the citadel walls, and a bridge connected the palace area across the walls and across the moat to the Asad Mahal, as this is called. It faces onto a great pond here, and these columns are really modern replacements. They would be more ornate, more decorated with beautiful brackets. And it was designed as a palace and later turned into a religious reliquary. And the Sultan would appear here in this Loggia, in this sort of opening space at the upper level, and people could assemble around the pond. So it had a ceremonial purpose where the Sultan could appear before people with barely leaving his palace. The inside of the Asad Mahal is very beautifully decorated with murals. So here we have, at the end of the 16th, turn of the 17th century, a wonderful catalogue of architectural mural design. Here you can see all of the walls are covered with these sort of bluish poppies just growing, morning glories rather, which are growing in continuous vine formation so as to create a complete coverage of floral designs. And in the niches of these upper chambers are these imaginative pots with funny foliation. And look at this decoration here. This is all in relief plasterwork. It's painted with a gilded background, and it is in the most refined Timurid style. And by Timurid, I'm referring to the art traditions established by Timur, who was in Samarkand and who died in the early 15th century, but whose descendants propagated a style throughout what is now Afghanistan and Iran, and then was inherited by the Mughals. What you're looking at is contemporary with the Mughals, but not Mughal. So this is Deccan Sultanate style of the early 17th century. Now, after the victory over Vijayanagara in 1565, Ali I, this great Bijapur ruler, was able to build this stupendous Jami Masjid. This was the largest congregational mosque in the Deccan of the middle of the 16th century. Its date is 1576, so just a few years after 1565, 11 years after the victory. He built this really immense project. It has, of course, a typical courtyard with side arcades and a prayer hall at the end, which looks like this. Now here we have one of the most remarkable instances of a structural device that was imported into India from the Persianate world, probably Central Asia, Eastern Iran, and maybe Afghanistan, of intersecting arches. You can see these arches come up and then they go like this, then another one goes like that. So they intersect to form a sort of, they hold each other together like a sort of net, and it's extremely efficient structurally. So it's not something that was invented in Bijapur, but it was, I would like to suggest, perfected. I'll show you later on an even more extraordinary example. Now, at the end of the hall is the mihrab. This is, of course, the niche or the wall that indicates the direction of Mecca, always on the west in Indian mosques, as you must know. And this is one of the great projects, perhaps the greatest mihrab in Indian Islamic architecture. What you're looking at is not just a niche where to pray, but a complete wall. And it replaces an earlier mihrab. It was added in 1636, so it's a later alteration of the building, under the supervision of an Abyssinian officer, a Habshi, and Mohammed I, Shah, who was a later sultan. So for some reason he commissioned a new mihrab, and they decided to make a complete wall of it. And what you're looking at, somebody stands about this high. So it's all in basalt, it's in very shallow relief, and it's painted and it's gilded. And it is a complete repertory, a complete catalogue of Islamic motifs, calligraphy, and, as you will see in a minute, these marvelous hanging medallions on chains. It's depictions of chains and these alams, like standards, filled with Quranic quotations. Here again, Quranic, and this wonderful foliation, all in gilded relief work on a dark blue background. It's one of the most sumptuous and beautifully executed projects that we have from the middle of the 17th century. And it resembles this sort of thing. This is a manuscript page from Bijapur of about the same period in exactly the same style. Here we have, you can see golden leafy designs, foliage, blossoms and leaves on a dark blue background with a calligraphic panel. So there is always a relationship between architectural decoration and decoration on paper and other materials. Another important building in Bijapur is what's known as the Mehta Mahal. This is a very, I would say, intriguing building. It faces onto a very busy road, as you can see, and actually it's just a gateway. You go through it, and then into a courtyard to a mosque, which isn't anything very special, but the gateway is obviously designed with an enormous impact on the street. It rises in 3 stories, and it has these projecting balconies. Can you see here? And here with these amazing struts, which are like timbers, and of course they're all done here in basalt, and they're cut out, so they're designs with holes in. And these tiny little minarets. This is of course not functional, they go all the way up like this. When you step in from the street, this is what you see. Here we have, I would say, virtuoso stone cutting. Here we have mortar, basalt blocks, and the designers of this building decided they would show off all sorts of ways of constructing interiors. So we have arches that go nowhere, they just stop. You see, they don't complete an arch. They're half arches, and they support these horizontal beams, which are in stone, suspended over the central space. And here rising up is all this cobbled timber-like ceiling with wonderful brackets, all cut out. No doubt there were wonderful wooden versions of this, but we don't have anything left. So it's a showcase of, I would say, stone skills, stone cutting skills, which the Adil Shahi architects were able to command. Now, one of the most intriguing personalities that we have from Bijapur is Ibrahim II. He ruled from 1580 to 1627, so almost 50 years. This is a painting in the British Museum of him. He was very interested in non-Islamic, let's say indigenous Hindu culture, and he wanted to bridge the different communities, and he was one of the great, I would say, literary and artistic patrons of the day. He also commissioned an epic funerary monument on the outskirts of Bijapur, and this is called the Ibrahim Rauza. What you're looking at the moment is, this is the tomb of Ibrahim and his principal queen, and this is the mosque. And they face each other across a little pool raised on a podium. The buildings look they're almost the same, but not the same. And this, I think, is very intriguing. Here you have 2 matching buildings that use the same elements. They have arches, they have these overhangs on brackets, they have this cluster of ornamental minarets and pinnacles and parapets and things, and then these peculiar domes raised high on petals like this. And this, I think, this relationship of similarity and contrast is very satisfying, so it never gets boring. This is the plan. Here is the tomb. It has a chamber here with windows and doorways, with a double veranda around it. This is a pool, and here is the mosque, where you can see the bays. And you enter from the north, you cross here, you climb up to this podium, and the rest is a walled garden. And this enters from a highway leading out of the city, running along like this. This is what you see when you walk into the veranda of the tomb. This is the corner of the sepulchral square chamber with doorways in the middle of each side and windows, and every surface is treated ornamentally, either through relief calligraphy or designs, or with painted designs which have faded. And the showcase, are these perforated calligraphic jalis. These are stone, no doubt wooden ones may have existed. So here we have calligraphy cut out, admitting light to the interior. So again, another way of showing what the Bijapur carvers were capable of. Here you can see some of the calligraphy going up here. Here we have medallions with calligraphy, funny little brackets in shallow relief. And this profusion, this visual sort of, I would say, information, which is so abundant, is completely released once you get inside the tomb. So this is completely austere. There's no decoration here at all. We have the tomb of the Sultan, his principal queen, and some of their children. And we have this great vault. And it goes up like this, and then it's flat. Now, to do a flat vault in stone, as you know, is extremely difficult. You have to cut with voussoirs in such a way. Another showcase of the skills. You don't look up into the dome. That's like a false space. And what's interesting, on the ceiling, above the tomb of the king is a mandala, 3 by 3 squares, in the middle of which is a lotus. This, of course, is a well-known design that we have throughout the history of Indian religious architecture. And it would seem here we have the Sultan, who wants to have above him a typically Indian sacred mandala with a lotus. So something's going on here that is very, very fascinating. His successor, Mohammed I, decided he wanted a very different tomb. He died in 1656, so 100 years after the victory over Vijayanagara. He didn't want a decorated tomb, he wanted a big one. And this is the biggest dome structure in Asia. And it depends how you measure a dome. I don't quite understand. There's one way is the circumference, the other is the actual volume that it shelters. But this compares with Santa Sofia in Constantinople, Istanbul, and St. Peter's in Rome. And it's never had any structural problems that I have read about. There's been no crackings and repairs, unlike Santa Sofia, which had to be propped up repeatedly throughout its history. And what you're looking at here is a colossal cubicle space with corner towers. These have staircases that lead up to the rooftop, and they do perform service by buttressing the building, which would extend outwards like this. Now, in the middle of each side is this stone panel. The rest is plastered, and this stone panel here gives you an idea of the scale. Now, it's absolutely colossal. So look at that, how big that is, and how it's just part of that. Don't ask me for the dimensions, they're in the book, which I'll tell you about. And the interior, it's one of the old 19th century drawings that the British were so good at doing with their teams of local draftsmen. Again, these intersecting arches. So there are 8 intersecting arches holding the whole thing together. An extremely efficient and brilliant structural system. No decoration, no painting, no nothing. It's just a demonstration of scale and majestic interior space. So it's a colossal building. Now, not all tombs were finished. This is an unfinished tomb which was built by Jahan Begum. She was the widow of this Muhammad I Abdullah Shah, but she never got to finish her own tomb, but already she started building the corner towers. It would have been something like her husband's tomb, perhaps not quite as big, but she's buried in a crypt which was finished. So that's the unfinished tomb. And next to this is a palace where she apparently used to go and spend time on weekends to see how her project was going along. You do understand, I think, that in Muslim culture, royal culture, sultans built their own tombs. They did not rely on their sons to build mausoleums. They had to finish them themselves because maybe their sons would rebel and would not finish their tombs. So she was there supervising the project, but she didn't live long enough to have it finished. And it's I would say, a rare example of palace architecture, with again these triple arches in the front. There would have been a sort of vault connecting this to the main chambers at the back, and it faces onto a lovely pond here. So it's a small, interesting idea of recreational architecture. And this is another one. Here we are at Kumatki. We're 12 kilometers outside Bijapur, and this was a pleasure resort, probably built towards the beginning of the 17th century, we don't know exactly. And the whole resort is based beneath a great dam with a great earthen bund, a great earthen wall, and water was siphoned off from the dam and somehow lifted up this tower, probably through intersecting water wheels manipulated by animals. These haven't been preserved, they would have been wooden. And there's a cistern at the top where water could be collected and then driven down under pressure to fill all these different ponds. And up in here there's even a shower, a sort of spray. So you have to understand, in this arid Deccan climate, the provision of water, especially in hot times of the year, was perhaps the most imaginable luxury, greater than gold or silver, to have water. So management of hydraulics is also an extremely important factor. This is the interior of one of the pavilions there at Kumatgi. You can see these very interesting fluted pendentives, and there are paintings here, much faded and really in need of sort of infrared investigation to recapture the scenes, and little pools, so again fed by water. So this gives you an idea, I think, of the architectural range of Bijapur. Now, I think we're going to go back to our map. Just remind ourselves, we were in this area. So let's say the central western Deccan. Now we're going to the eastern Deccan, the Qutb Shahis. This is now Hyderabad Golconda, which is the capital, as you probably know, of the new state of Telangana. And Golconda, of course, is famous, as some of you must know, for diamonds. India was the only place where diamonds could be found until the late 18th century. So if you were in Europe or China and you wanted diamonds, you had to come to India. So there were lots of foreign visitors coming to Golconda, gem merchants, and all of the crown jewels of Europe, including those of the British royal family, were to begin with Golconda diamonds. And Golconda is the name of a citadel and also the name of the kingdom. So they weren't found at Golconda, but within the territories of Golconda. And if I understand correctly, they were found in riverbeds. They had washed out of stone embankments. They were not mined as they came to be in later times. They were just found in lumps. And then European aesthetics demanded that they be chiseled away into facets so that they sparkled. This is the Hope Diamond. It's in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. It's one of the great Golconda diamonds with this extraordinary bluish tinge. And here is Abdullah Qutb Shah in the early 17th century, one of the later Qutb Shahis, watching a dance performance within his pavilion inside his palace. They're all having a very good time. As you can see, lots of people are dancing and singing. Huge amount of wealth and entertainment. So this was one of the great royal courts of the Deccan. And we even have elephants here, seem to be lustrating them, and all sorts of parasols and other emblems of royal figures with a parasol here at the top. So something of the lavishness of life in Golconda is captured by paintings of the period. This one's in the British Museum. But when you go to Golconda, you can't see much of that anymore. But what you can see is this sort of epic scale of the architecture. What you're looking at here are the outer walls of Golconda city, and they go in a circuit around Golconda Citadel, which is a natural granite hill with walls on top of which is a residential palace. So this was the original Golconda city, and it's a double wall of, you see two walls here, and then there was a wall. This is an overgrown zone. This is the top of Golconda Citadel. What's of course marvelous is the way that the granite walls climb up and over the boulders. You see, they're all built on top, and they I would say, exploit the natural landscape. And so it becomes a rocky citadel which is built all up with this dry stone granite masonry. Another view of the walls. Here's the walls of the city, and you can just see some of the water in the moat outside the city. And of course, modern Hyderabad is now extending right up to medieval Golconda. This is one of the gates into the city of Golconda. Look at these massive polygonal bastions with these machicolations. These are little chambers which have holes in the bottom through which you can pour disgusting things onto people who are trying to approach you, like boiling oil. Yes. And here we have a buffalo just coming through a gateway. So I think Golconda still preserves something of its medieval fortified character. And these gateways needed to be protected not only by people, but by imagery. And this is the type of sculptures that we have on the walls as you pass through the gateways. This is a scene of mythical animals, yalis we call them in South India, suppressing elephants. It's a motif that we find throughout martial or military architecture in the Deccan. It's not particularly Islamic or Hindu. We find the Marathas use it. It's a long history. But here it is as we go in through one of the gateways into the city. There are lots of these wonderful panels. Passing through the middle of Golconda city, we arrive at the front gate of the citadel. And as we do, we pass through these two enormous porticos. See, there's one here, and there's another one here, and they are mirror images of each other. They're great cubical buildings with two open arches. So two walls are solid, and two are open like that. And this is where guards were kept to control, tax, and check on who was approaching the palace area. So they have a ceremonial rather than a defensive purpose, but they also needed to be magically, I would say, protective for the sultans, and so they were provided with all this plaster imagery, with all these sort of fantastic lions and animals and even winged creatures. This is all a fantasy sort of decoration charged with, I would say, magical power. This is the front gate, the front doorway, the Balahissa gate, probably 16th century. You can see, quite plain, a great arch, little animals are here, peacocks are there, a stone lintel, and again we have these machicolations at the top. This, of course, this type of military architecture, this language, if you like, is very close to what was happening in Europe in 15th and 16th century too. And there must have been crossovers through the Islamic world of ideas going backwards and forwards, whether it was gunpowder, the use of cannon, the type of ways of designing gateways. And we still have to understand better the impact of Middle Eastern military architecture on the Deccan. And I suspect we'd learn a lot from Anatolia, from medieval Turkey. Looking down on the palace complex of Golconda, this is of course a great ruin. It's hugely extensive. It's never been exhaustively mapped. I've never seen I've only seen rough drawings of it, so it's something, a future project. And it seems to have a rhythmic progression from north to south. As you go, in a sense, from left to right, that's the southern extremity, you go from more public zones to more extreme private zones. So this is probably, the back is where the zanana, the women of the court, were housed in very confined little courtyards. This is where maybe the sultan met with his inner advisors, inner people, and then maybe more later ones, and out here are more the audience halls. It's a ruin, but very evocative. You can see, looking through to one of the courtyards, this is the citadel on the top, and this is one of the most pertinent of the halls. We don't know quite what this was used for. This was obviously a water body, and the only occupants these days seem to be the dogs. And look at the way in which the walls are treated with these multiple niches. If any of you have been to Iran or you know Safavid architecture of the 16th and 17th century, you'll be familiar with this type of treatment. And look at this vaulting with these sort of intersecting nets, squinch nets. So these kite-shaped little pendentives in here. So something very, very nicely worked out, but missing all its plaster, colouring, and its finesse of decoration. So we don't have much idea, only from the paintings. Now, 500 meters outside Golconda city, we have the necropolis. We have the tombs of the Qutb Shahis, and this was a garden funerary complex where all of the Qutb Shahi sultans are buried. And at the extreme right, this one here, right-hand one, is the tomb of the first of the Qutb Shahis. This is one of the later ones. So they start off quite modestly with cubical chambers and domes raised on petals. And then we have things like this. This is the tomb of Jamshid Qutb Shah. He died in 1550. It's the only octagonal tomb we have. It's in 2 stories on the outside, but inside it's one single chamber all the way up. It's recently been refurbished. The Aga Khan Trust for Heritage has been working here, and as far as I know, they may have already finished their work of restoring the tombs and trying to rehabilitate the gardens and the waterworks that flow through the plantations. So it's a very handsome and very distinctive tomb architecture, completely different than what we've been looking at in Bijapur. This is looking up into the dome of the tomb of Ibrahim Qutb Shah. He died in 1580. Just look at the articulation of these arches, all these facets, very, very busy, all in plaster covered, brickwork and stone beneath and brick on top, looking up into the dome with these intersecting sort of arch niches right up into the dome. Now this is the largest and most, I would say, impressive of the Qutb Shahi domes. It's the tomb of Mohammed. He died in 1612, and it's the grandest. And you can see all of the attention in terms of plasterwork is on this upper level, on these parapets and cornices. These of course go all the way up, but the lower parts are quite plain. Then we have this immense dome on these petals. But look at the treatment of the middle of each side. There are these porticos that look like this. And what you have here is an imitation again of wooden architecture. These are stone, these very slender columns with these brackets is typical of timber architecture, of course. So they always want to have this reference maybe to palace architecture. I can't be sure. We don't have anything left. These brackets inside. So the wall is opened up to have these triple bayed porticos. And this is the tomb of Abdullah Qutb Shah. He died in 1672. He was almost the last of the great Qutb Shahs before the Mughals came by and extinguished the dynasty. And the triangular composition, I think, is very clear. You can see how the whole thing goes up like this. We have a lower arcaded chamber. You enter it here. Then we have false, or let's say shallow arcades, lesser cubicle, repeating. Look at these corner things, these come up, and then of course the great dome. So it's very impressive, I would say, as an architectural composition, very satisfying, and each of the tombs has slight variations. I mean, they're quite close, but it's always worth noting this. The interiors are fairly simple. They don't waste much. These later tombs of the Qutb Shahis are much simpler, but impressive. It's just very plain tombs. Now, I should add that the tombs of the Qutb Shahis and those of the Adil Shahis have this very interesting device of duplicating the tomb. The actual grave of the Sultan is at ground level and it's inaccessible, generally. It's in a chamber that's locked, or it's boarded up, or it's earthened up. And then on the visiting level, you have a cenotaph, you have a replica. This happens in Mughal architecture. Those of you who've been to the Taj Mahal, when you could visit, there is a tomb beneath, and then there are the cenotaphs, the very decorated ones on top. Now, where does this, why do you need to have duplicated tombs? This is something which we've all been wondering about. But Timur, who died in, I think, 1405, his tomb in Samarkand has this feature. His grave is at a lower level, and then his jade tomb, which is an amazing slab, is at the upper level. And it may have something to do with this Turco-Mongol culture that came out of Central Asia, about which I can't tell you much, but it's got nothing to do with Islam, let's say the Arab and Persian world. It's got something to do with another world, and it dominates tomb architecture in much of India, and certainly in this part of the Deccan. Queens were also prominent in the necropolis in Golconda. This is the mosque of Hayat Bakshi Begum. She was the mother of Abdullah. She must have been a formidable woman because she sponsored a great tomb for herself. She wasn't content to be buried beside her husband, and she built a wonderful mosque. And this is perhaps the most beautiful mosque in the Golconda central area. You see these enormous minarets with staircase, and they do have galleries. You can go up to this level. Again, this treatment of the upper parapet level. And very impressive, always with a pair of minarets framing the facade. And the interior, it's quite articulated, I would say. Look at the way in which the arches take off from the tops of the columns. These, I wouldn't call them brackets, but it's very strange the way they do this, and it catches the light, very effective. And there is a basalt, a stone mihrab, just to give you a sense of direction. And these kite-shaped pendentives up here. And also, as part of the necropolis, is a hammam. And there's a lot of nonsense written about this to say it was a mortuary hammam. The supposition being that sultans, once they died, the bodies were laid out in the hammam and they were cleaned and washed and embalmed and blah 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 and all that, none of which can possibly be true. This is not the tradition. These were pleasure places because the court inside the palace at Golconda used to go on weekend, what you call picnics or stayovers in the gardens on the outside of the city, and of course the men, perhaps the women, wanted a hammam, and they also needed a sarai where they could stay with their animals. So this necropolis is furnished with these sorts of structures, and now they're beginning to recover some of the palaces, or let's say weekend residences. But this is a very wonderful 12-sided podium, and you can see these spiral, slightly curving strips of different coloured stone set into the top. So it's extremely elegant hammam, and we have one within the palace area as well. Now, as the 16th century proceeded, and Golconda became extremely wealthy and became a cosmopolitan centre, not only for diamonds, but for textiles and other trades, especially with the Bay of Bengal coast and Southeast Asia. This became one of the great cities of India, and it was in full swing just as the Mughals were starting their careers. Anyhow, it was found that the city was too small, and they needed to found a new city. And so Mohammed Qutb Shah decided that he would, in the year 1000, found a millennial city, which he called Hyderabad. And the year 1000 in the Hijra, in the Muslim calendar, translates in our calendar as 1591. So in 1591, Hyderabad was created, the city of Hyderabad, and it had as its centerpiece two bazaar streets like this, a north-south street and an east-west street. It wasn't fortified, it was laid out with different quarters, and here's the River Musi, and about 5 kilometers away was Golconda up here. And as a centerpiece of this city was the Char Minar. None of you who've been to Hyderabad will have failed to visit this extraordinary monument, built in 1591 and still standing, complete. Its name derives, of course, from the 4 minarets. It has no function whatsoever except as an urban marker. We are looking through one of the streets, and there's another cross street, and there was up here a gallery where proclamations could be read out to the public. Perhaps the Sultan appeared here, and there was a little mosque on the top, but this was not for public use. So it's a ceremonial building, something which only makes sense within an urban context. So it looks the same all the way around, and it's colossal. You see the height of people here. What an amazing building it is. And immediately to the north are these great arches. There are 4 of them. They're called the Char Kaman, the 4 bows. And they once demarked a huge open plaza with a gateway in the middle of each of 4 sides. Nothing is left of the plaza because it's all been filled in over the years, but this was a sort of parade ground, a sort of Maidan, where the soldiers, the troops, the animals of the Qutb Shahis could all be paraded, off which opened the palace area. All this has completely disappeared, sadly, and all that we have left is a fountain in the middle, rebuilt, but here you can see one of the Char Kamans, and here is the other one in a sort of shot. So these 4 have here, and they converged on this fountain. So one of the great pieces of, I would say, urban planning of the late 16th century. Now, among the buildings that were erected towards the end of the 16th century is the Badshahi Ashokana. This was connected with the Shiite population. In the Deccan, there was always a shift between Sunni and Shiite. The kings often vacillated between one or the two. There were always these different communities. And this was not necessarily a source of great conflict. And this is a present-day Ashur Khana, which is where the standards which are used in the Muharram festival are kept. And it was built in 1593, and about 20 years later, the interior was completely surfaced with ceramic tiles. This is one of the great decorative architectural projects that we have from the Deccan. Walls on three sides are completely covered with tile mosaics. Tile mosaics means that every color is a separate piece of tile. You don't paint two colors on one tile. You cut out different colored tiles and piece them together in a sort of mosaic. You can imagine what an amount of work this must be, especially if you're going to create these sorts of designs. The reason for this is that if you fire ceramics of different colors at different temperatures, you get the most brilliant results. Now here we have a representation of alams. These are the standards that are carried in Muharram festival, metallic versions of which are actually kept in the Ashur Khana because this is a functioning religious monument at times, at festival times, and these medallions, look at this rotating calligraphy. Could you imagine achieving this in little bits of different colored ceramics with all the flowers going in circles around it? So it's an incredible feat. And just look at this dazzling display of different designs, of calligraphy, of imaginative and slightly weird pots and foliation, and patterns, leafy patterns here, with all these orange and yellow and turquoise and green colours, which are very typical of the Deccan palette. And if I had more time and I had the pictures, I'd show you paintings from the Qutb Shahi Golconda Hyderabad world, which have exactly the same sorts of colour schemes. The biggest mosque in Hyderabad is what is known as the Mecca Masjid. It was begun by Mohammed Qutb Shah in 1617 and was hugely ambitious, and of course would have had great minarets that went all the way up, but he never got beyond about this point, and they look sort of stunted and unsatisfactory. It makes its effect by scale. It's just huge. It's not pretty, it doesn't have any decoration, but the interior is quite monumental. So these are grand urban mosques which function as a place of worship for, 1,000+ people. You see these typical arches again, these kite-shaped preventives, but no decoration, at least that has survived from that period. A much more ornamented mosque, which gives you an idea really of Qutb Shahi decoration. It's almost like Rococo Qutb Shahi architecture. Just look at the treatment of these upper parts here, with an overhang or brackets, little decoration here, and then we have more brackets here, which don't perform any real structural function. This is all a parapet to conceal the roof, with little tiny minarets, and then big ones up here, which you cannot ascend. You can't get up there with a sort of pond in front. Very vertical and very decorated. Some of the details there you can see. Look at this plaster work. So you have plain plaster surfaces and relief plaster work in deeply cut hard plaster, and it catches the light and forms these richly decorated effects like this. And again, you can see the sort of ornamental things. And one of my favorite interiors, I've decided I really do like this color scheme. I just think this green and cream is just fantastic because it articulates the architecture. This is the interior of Khairati Begum's mosque. She was a daughter of one of the sultans, and she built a mosque for her spiritual advisor, and this is what it looks like. Here is the main niche for prayer, and just look again, these kite-shaped pendentives in different colors. I think this is quite an effective way of dealing with an interior. Maybe it's, I don't know whether the conservationists would quite approve. Anyhow, they haven't been consulted. This is the Waqf committee, I guess. So, 1626. And I think I've come to the end of these two chapters because I've taken two parts of the story of the Deccan There are really 7 or 8 such stories. These are just 2 from the 16th and 17th centuries, and 2 of the ones that I think have the most architectural diversity, because Bijapur and Golconda, Hyderabad, were 2 of the great centers of architectural invention from the middle of the 16th century until the Mughals took over in the 1680s. And if you want to learn more about it, we have our wonderful book, which is with Martinelli's photographs, which I have authored with Helen Filon, who is a great specialist on Islamic architecture, and somebody that I met when I was a student in SOAS too many years ago, with Antonio Martinelli's photographs that you have enjoyed this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Michelle, for that wonderful, erudite presentation on this rich subject. Indeed, just to start where he ended off, his book is in the library, and people are very welcome to access that. Unfortunately, it was on loan, so we couldn't take it out to show you. There are 2 other books relating to his work on the Islamic tradition in India. One is the Marg issue on the Deccan, and the other is his volume on the Islamic world. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Dr. Michelle, for sharing so generously your knowledge and your experience. And so 2 things just to reflect on. Dr. Michelle has spent a lifetime looking. So we all have eyes in our head. I keep reminding people of this fact. We have the capacity to see, but it's the discipline of establishing an order that actually matters. So we can see in general or in specific. So each of us here has that capacity. So thanks, Dr. Michelle, for sharing that very specific and disciplined act of looking and recording the fact, so that in seeing, it doesn't just get, it's not a conversation, it's a resource. So those of you who are interested, perhaps academically, there's a path there, but those of you who are designers, there is a wealth of inspiration in the forms of architecture that he's talked about. So there's a history, there's a response to materials, to space, to scale. It's unbelievable. And so in the tradition of designing and designing for now, there's nothing stopping you drawing on that. So at many levels, Dr. Michelle, thank you very much. If anyone would like to share anything of their particular interest, or if they have any questions to pose to Dr. Michelle, he's very happy to take any inquiries. And there's somebody down there, if we could get you. We just wait for the microphone there, sir.
You mean gilded decoration using gold? It's a good question. I know that the mihrab I showed is the 1630s, but I'm not sure that I've seen earlier surviving. No, actually 1580s, 1590s, the Hassan Mahal has gilded backgrounds. So remember, we're only seeing a fraction of what must have been done. But I think from the late 16th century, they did use gold when they could afford it.
And even the paintings and profuse use of gold.
Right.
So I think it must be related to architecture.
Sure.
Where the murals and painted walls.
Thank you.
Michelle, the rooms which you see in the Deccan architecture are very unique. Do they have any history? Because they have got a very unique form on the petals. You don't find it in early Mughals or in medieval architecture.
Well, it goes back to the 14th century, the first Islamic architecture in the Deccan under the Bahmanis, quite plain. By the end of the 14th century, little merlons appear, like battlements. And then little by little, these merlons turn outwards and they become petals. So it's a sort of transition from things from military architecture become a sort of decorative device, and then in Mijapur they make like this, completely ornamental. So they do have a history, yes.
Yeah. A lot of certain architecture has regional influence. Gujarat. But over here, say 1600s, 1700s, this certain architecture, though it is very close to, say Vijayanagar, South India, doesn't carry a lot of regional influence. Why so?
Are you suggesting that Deccan architecture is less regional than Gujarati architecture? Because it's not so connected with the pre-Islamic architecture of the region. But nonetheless, it has a character of its own. You would never mistake a Bijapur or Hyderabad or Golconda building with one in Ahmedabad, in Bengal, in Malwa, or anywhere else. But it does have occasional overlaps with the Vijayanagara tradition, or let's say with the Hindu, pre-Islamic tradition, especially in the overhangs, the brackets, the treatment, some of the columns and the brackets. So there are overlaps. But Gujarat is a particularly, I would say, intense interaction between pre-Islamic and Islamic periods, because so many of your monuments here reuse or imitate things taken out of temples, as we know, the decoration, the pots on chains, in the mihrab and all that. So it's very pronounced here in Gujarat, I would agree, but we have a different set of regional characteristics here in the Deccan.
Thank you very much for a lovely lecture. Could you explain about the relationships between the Deccan and places like Samarkand and Bukhara, because of which there are these similarities? So there's a Charminar in Bukhara, a tilework. You mentioned the similarities with the Timurid dynasty.
Well, you must remember that people could get to the Deccan without going through North India. They just had to the coast of what is now the southern coast of Iran, the Gulf, go by ship and end up on the west coast of India and go straight to Bijapur. So there was a direct link between the Persianized world of Iran and Central Asia and also the Anatolian world. Now the Charminar in Bukhara, am I right?
Yeah.
Well, when I got there, I suddenly thought, which you may have seen on your visit there, I thought, well, this is where it all comes from. The Charminar, you see, it was invented in Bukhara and was taken and placed in Hyderabad where they invented it. It's not at all true. The Charminar in Bukhara is later. It's an imitation of Hyderabad. So, you see, this was a very inventive thing. We shouldn't overstress the dependence on external Islamic architecture. Under the Bahmanis, we have a Timurid transplant. If you've been to Bidar, we have a madrasa which is exactly like a madrasa from eastern Iran or western Afghanistan, built on Indian soil. It's the only example in all of India. And that was in the 1460s by an immigrant from northern Iran. So we do have these moments when an architectural idea is completely exported into the Deccan, not via Delhi. It comes straight into the Deccan. So it's receptive through its ports on the Arabian Sea coast to these influences. So it has another sort of relationship to the wider Islamic world. And this is true in the decorative arts and in painting.
Thank you.
So as we saw from the examples of the mosque, the architecture is very open and the spaces are even multifunctional. But when it comes to their social structure, I feel it's a little rigid in terms of the hierarchy. So how is it that is incorporated in the architecture?
I don't think I can answer that question. All these architectures, everything I've shown you, has hierarchy, has social aspects. It's true of all Islamic architecture. in the Deccan and elsewhere in India. I don't think the Deccan is different, but I mean especially the palace architecture has very distinctive ranges of different types of open and closed spaces which must have had functions about which we do not have enough information historically. So we can only look at these buildings and imagine a sort of social hierarchies. So of course they existed. This was a world of social hierarchy. It's totally, but to say it's rigid is a judgment which is something which we should just keep our minds open. It's not for us to say it's rigid, it was just of that period in that particular way.
Thank you, Doctor, for the presentation. I would like to ask you that when we look at the Shahis of the Bijapur area, why did they leave the interiors not decorated? Why did they not decorate the interiors of the architectural spaces that were built?
But that's not true. I showed you the Asad Mahal, which had these wonderful murals.
But when it comes to Ibrahim Roza and the
The Ibrahim Roza was decorated on the external walls, and when you went in, it was austerely plain. And this must have been a conscious decision to go from the world of visual, I would say, attractions and pleasures to something very austere. And it's a very spiritual experience if you've been to Ibrahim Roza to go into that space. It's very impressive. So I would say the decision making about where to put decoration, it's not something that has been studied in any degree for Deccan. It's something which is very consciously manipulated by the architects for a particular effect, especially in Ibrahim Roza. And of course, the Golconda has no decoration at all. It's completely undecorated. So we have these different extremes of the use of decoration. Thank you.
Double dome that is said to be modeled after the Golconda's Bijapur.
Is that so?
Yeah, and then I also came across one example that said that Nyaya Mandir also has some elements that are taken from Ibrahim Roza. So while I was reading about the Baroda and Bijapur connection, I came across this architect Robert Chisholm, who has been kind of played a major part in architecture of Baroda and also was a principal of Madras School. So what I would want to know is, are there any more examples?
There are. Bombay, the museum in Bombay is a Bijapur style building, intersecting arches. The post office in Bombay, you see? One of the explanations is that Bijapur was one of the first historical cities in India to be photographed properly in, I think, even the 1850s. And one of the Maharajas, I can't remember which one now, he funded a publication, like a great album of photographs with measure drawings. Chisholm wasn't involved in this project, but he must have been familiar with it, as were architects in Bombay. And they were inspired by this imagery of this art, even if they hadn't been to Bijapur. So Bijapur was the best, I would say, publicized, advertised architecture of the Deccan. Perhaps after the Mughals, then came Bijapur. So I think this gives you some background as to how this type of architecture came to influence the work of Chisholm, though, which is more imaginative. But the Prince of Wales Museum, or what used to be the Prince of Wales Museum, has this great Bijapur sort of, character, as does the post office in Bombay.
Could we also broadly or generally term this into a neo-Deccan style of architecture emerging out of the colonial architecture?
Well, it could be a neo-Bijapur style, yes. I mean, it could be Bijapur, Anglo-Bijapur style, Bijapur Anglo style. Why not? Why not? It is, in a way, modified by these British architects with a huge amount of imagination. I must say, I think the MS University building, isn't it? It has this dome in Baroda, and I mean, I think the museum in Bombay is one of the most beautiful museums, perhaps the most beautiful interior that we have in India. post office I can't remember very much about. It's too crowded to get to. But it's also, and of course we have Neo Ahmedabad. You think of Gateway of India in Bombay. That's a sort of based on an Ahmedabad. So there are these crossovers. These British architects didn't hesitate to exploit Indian architecture, and Lutyens, for all his bad-mouthing of the Indian architectural tradition, look what he did in Delhi, the sort of Sanchi Stupa combined with Rajput things. So architects, you know what they do? They say one thing and do another. We know that already. Okay, thank you everybody.
Thank you again, Dr. Michelle, and thanks to you all for supporting the CEPT Library Lecture Series, and we look forward to seeing you soon again. Dr. Erik Brand Dam will be coming next week from Copenhagen to talk about that city and about urbanism there. Thank you again, and you're very welcome indeed. Bye-bye.